Well, welcome everyone to another Great Authors at Google session. We have the amazing honor and privilege to have here at Google once again Condoleezza Rice. Folks may have been at the great talk that we had a couple years ago when, as Secretary of State, she was here with Foreign Secretary David Miliband from the UK, and we had a great session then. And we're here to talk this time about her book. Obviously, she needs very little introduction from me, but we really would love to get into have her talk about her new book, which is really, really fascinating in terms of her upbringing in Alabama. We were talking before the show here and before the session that I have a fairly personal connection, and we turns out we have some to-do items after the fact here, because if you've read any of the book, you'll discover that Secretary Rice's maternal grandfather's name was Albert Ray, was from Alabama, outside of Birmingham. It turns out my maternal grandfather's name was Edward Ray, also from outside of Birmingham, Alabama, and my mother was born right outside of Birmingham. So we're thinking there's some connection.
There.
So if I call her cousin in the middle of this, you will know why. So I think what we're going to try to do is through a Q&A format, try to talk a little bit about the book and sort of what's going on, Stanford football, those kinds of things, and then have some time for you all to ask some questions too. So the first thing I wanted to ask was, obviously in the book you talk a lot about your childhood in Birmingham, and you described it as the most segregated city in all of America in the 50s and 60s. So can you share with us a little bit, I know this is in the book, but can you share with us a little bit about your experiences with segregation and how that affected your sort of aspirations growing up?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thanks for having me
Yes.
here. It's great to be here. And I can only tell this story by saying, first of all, that I was born in 1954 in Birmingham, Alabama. Now, before you start counting, that makes me 55, 56 next month. And Birmingham in 1954 was really two very separate societies. On the one hand, I grew up in black middle-class Birmingham, a little conclave in Birmingham called Titusville. And we had in our schools, we had instrumental band, I had piano lessons, ballet lessons. My parents were in many ways kind of, I've said in the book, ordinary people. My mom was a school teacher, an English teacher. She actually taught as one of her first students Willie Mays, and he said that she told him, "Son, you're going to be a ball player, and if you need to leave class a little bit early, you go right ahead." So he appreciates that. My mom also was a musician, quite elegant lady who believed in the democracy of the arts, and so in her very tough neighborhood high school, introduced operettas and fine music. My dad was a high school guidance counselor, Presbyterian minister, later on university administrator. His domain was sports. I was supposed to be an All-American linebacker named John, and he had bought John's football. Much to his surprise, he had a daughter, but he was a big and imposing man and very interested in politics and history. But they were in that way ordinary people, but they were also extraordinary for the times in which they lived. And in Birmingham, it really was very separate societies. You couldn't go to a restaurant. You couldn't go to a movie theater. I did not have a white classmate until we moved to Denver when I was 12. It was completely segregated. Most of the time, because my little enclave was one where the kids were very much the center of attention and taken care of, segregation didn't intrude every day. Right. You lived in this little separate cocoon. But occasionally you had to meet the outside world, and I tell a couple of those stories. For instance, going to see Santa Claus when I was 5 years old, and you know what the drill is. You go to the department store, you stand in line, Santa Claus puts you on his knee, says, "What do you want for Christmas?" Well, my parents were watching this particular Santa Claus take the little black kids and stand them out here, and take the little white kids and put them on his knee. And my father, I heard my father say to my mother, Angelina, if he does that to Condoleezza, I'm going to pull all that stuff off of him and show him to be the cracker that he is. And as you might imagine, little 5-year-old Condi goes ahead with kind of trepidation. Okay, Santa Claus Daddy, Santa Claus Daddy. This Santa Claus must have felt my father's size, because he pulled me on his knee and said, little girl, what would you like for Christmas? So all's well that ends well. But it shows how racially charged Birmingham could be. And so that's the community that I grew up in.
Right. Now, but despite the segregation and discrimination, so forth, you've also said in the book that this community was a place where you sort of had you convinced that you could be president of the United States.
Absolutely. You couldn't have a hamburger at Woolworth's lunch counter, but you could be president of the United States if you wanted to be. And it wasn't just me. It was really the entire community, where teachers were the most important people in the community, where principals of schools were giants in the community. One of the principals there was a man named R.C. Johnson, who was the principal of Parker High School, the largest black school in Birmingham. He was the father of Alma Johnson Powell, who is Colin Powell's wife. And this community told you, there are no victims, there are no excuses. You are going to have to be twice as good. And it was, by the way, not said as a matter for debate. It was said as a fact. And I think in that way instilled in us this sense that if we were educated, it was going to be transforming. It was armor against racism. Even if they, meaning the white man, didn't like you, they would have to respect you. And that's how I grew up.
And so you did lots of things besides school. You did, skating. You wanted to be a figure skater.
I wanted to be a figure skater.
Piano lessons.
Yes,
you
piano
still
lessons.
perform, I understand.
Well,
not as much,
well, piano was actually kind of an interesting story,
Okay.
because I studied piano from age 3. My grandmother taught piano lessons. I took piano lessons with her. I was going to be a great concert pianist. I went off to college, majored in music for 2 years, and then went to the Aspen Music Festival School, where I met 12-year-olds who could play from sight, everything it had taken me all year to learn. I thought I'm about to end up teaching 13-year-olds to murder Beethoven for a living, or maybe I'm going to play at Nordstrom, but I'm not going to play Carnegie Hall. And I went back and I had one of those uncomfortable conversations with my parents. Mom and Dad, I'm changing my major. What are you changing your major to, dear? I don't know. You don't know what you want to do with your life. Well, after all, it's my life. Well, after all, it's our money. Find a major. And fortunately for me, I wandered into a course in international politics taught by a Soviet specialist. And his name was Joseph Corbell. He was Madeleine Albright's father. And Joseph Corbell opened up this incredible world to me of things international, things Russian. And I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a Soviet specialist. And luckily for me, when I went home and said, gee, Mom and Dad, I found it. I want to be a Soviet specialist, they didn't say, what's a nice black girl from Birmingham, Alabama, talking about being a Soviet specialist. They said, go for it. And that's how I got into the field.
Right. But yet your memoir, at least, so hopefully that this means there's perhaps a part 2, because your memoir is focused on your childhood and your upbringing.
That's right.
So can we expect a part 2 about your career? And
well, yes. As I was leaving government, I had to decide what I was going to write, and I will. Everybody writes the obligatory Secretary of State's 8-year memoir, and I will write that memoir, and in fact writing it now. But I'm very often asked, how did you become who you are? And I felt that people had to know John and Angelina Rice in order to answer that question. And I wanted to do this as a book that shows how important good parents are, how important good community is, how important focus on education and values can be, and how even in the extraordinary circumstances of segregated Birmingham, this little community raised extraordinary kids. I'm not, by the way, even the first PhD in my family. Right. My grandfather managed to get a college education. My aunt, my father's sister, was a professor of Victorian literature, of all things. She wrote books on Dickens. And the kids in my community, the first black woman governor of the International Monetary Fund, the man who's currently the president of the University of Maryland, Baltimore, the man who's currently president of the University of Missouri, Kansas City, 2 Pulitzer Prize winners, that little community, thanks to the way that this community dealt with its kids, very accomplished.
Right. Well, I wanted to ask you a couple of other questions about race. You know, sometimes we have a tendency to hear people talk about an authentic Black experience.
Yeah.
And oftentimes it's sometimes equated with what your political views happen to be. It's no mystery to most people that you have had political views that are not necessarily the same as as the majority, at least as expressed in the ballot box. Majority of other Black Americans. How do you when someone says, well, you know, she's a Republican, so how can she's not really Black?
Yeah. Right.
How do you deal with that?
Well, the first thing I tell people is I don't need anybody to tell me how to be Black. I've been Black all my life. I know how to do that, right? And in fact, the unfortunate thing is that it doesn't just relate to being a Republican. That's fine, and I can explain to you why I'm a Republican. Came from foreign policy initially, and didn't care much for Jimmy Carter's response to the invasion of Afghanistan by boycotting the Olympics. I thought surely the United States can do better than that, and I voted for Ronald Reagan. But my views are eclectic political views. You know, I say in the book, I favor affirmative action. I am also a fierce defender of the Second Amendment. So my views are kind of all over the place, as I think most Americans' views are, and I think we get very much putting people into little boxes. But it is also the case, unfortunately, that this stuff about authentically Black, which I have no idea what that's supposed to mean, has begun to translate into, well, you're not authentically Black if you study hard, and you're not authentically Black if maybe you major in engineering. You know, that's shooting yourself in the head. To me, authentically Black meant Black Birmingham was going to achieve at a level that white America couldn't ignore it. And I think that's the most authentically Black that I can possibly express.
Absolutely. Well, one other question. In the book, you talk about your view of the term African-American.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit how you see that term,
Yes,
since it's so frequently used now?
I don't actually like this term African-American. I prefer Black, and I'll tell you why. I think that African-American mimics an immigration narrative that is actually not the Black narrative. Europeans and Africans came to this country together, Africans in chains.
Right.
And we built this country together not because Africans came here by choice, but because Africans were forced to come here. We also have all kinds of crazy intertwined genes in the American gene pool. And I understand why it was done. It was meant to make a connection to Africa, but I fear that it actually lets us off the hook for dealing with, first of all, the birth defect of slavery and all that that meant. Secondly, dealing with the fact that the immigration narrative, there is one Black immigration narrative, West Indians who came here, like Colin Powell's parents. But for the children of the Confederacy, the children of Dixie, I like black and white. That's about as clear as it can get that this was a country built by forced labor of African slaves.
Right, right. Well, another question about the book. So you wanted to target it to young adults.
Yes.
And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about that and some of the lessons that you're hoping to convey.
Well, I'm hoping to convey to young adults that really my story shows that just about anything's possible. There is no earthly reason that a little girl who grew up in Birmingham, Alabama under those circumstances should have ended up as Secretary of State of the United States of America, and certainly getting there by the circuitous path of being a Soviet specialist. And so I try to say to young adults, don't let anybody define what it is you want to be by looking at you and saying, oh, well, you shouldn't be interested in those things. I mean, my passion was something that really was pretty odd for a black kid from Birmingham, but it just happened to be my passion. And because it was my passion, I was actually good at it, and that led to a whole set of outcomes. The other thing is to say what my parents believe fervently. You may not be able to control your circumstances, but you can control your reaction to your circumstances.
Right.
And if you see yourself as a victim of something, then you're going to feel aggrieved. And the other half of the coin of aggrievement is actually entitlement. Now they owe me this, and they owe me that, and that is a dead end in a society that doesn't reward aggrievement.
Yeah. So last week you were you met with President Obama.
I did.
In the Oval Office, and I assume you gave him a copy of the book.
I did. I gave him a copy of that book and a copy of the young adult version for
right.
Malia and Sasha.
Right. Excellent. So was this the first time you've been there since?
I've been to the White House, but not
but
to
not
see the president since the election. Right?
So we
No, I mean I've been to the White House since the Obama administration.
Understood. So we have to ask you, did you talk about foreign policy a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. So
We did.
Any of the counsel, the sage counsel that you gave him that you can tell us about?
Actually, one thing that may be worth noting is it's not that unusual for the sitting president to invite back a former cabinet office, particularly foreign policy, because despite all of our twists and turns and doing things a little bit differently, there really is a lot of continuity in American foreign policy, and it's awfully important that people in the world understand that it's bipartisan. And so President Bush would from time to time have former cabinet officials back, and so the president and I had a chance to kind of cover the waterfront and talk about a whole variety of things. And I had known him before because when I was Secretary of State, he was on the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate, which oversaw the State Department, and so we'd gotten to know each other before.
Right, great. So in terms of foreign policy these days, I mean, how are you thinking about it? Are you currently are you optimistic about American foreign policy and with the state of the world, pessimistic, and how do you think about it?
Well, in the long run, I'm optimistic. First of all, just because I'm an optimist to begin with, but also because I've seen the United States go through bad times and come out where what seemed impossible later on seems inevitable. I used to always remind myself when I was secretary that today's headlines and history's judgment are rarely the same. And I would keep portraits of secretaries of state near me to remind me of that. Thomas Jefferson, first secretary, everybody kept him. George Marshall, probably the greatest secretary, everybody kept him. But I kept Dean Acheson, who, when he left, was remembered for Who Lost China? Not now. And I kept William Seward. He bought Alaska. When he bought Alaska, you want to talk about rough congressional hearings? How could you have spent $7 million on that icebox to the Tsar of Russia? And several years later, I was talking to the man who was the defense minister of Russia, Sergei Ivanov. He said, Condi, I went to Alaska. It is so beautiful. Reminds me of Russia. Sergei, it used to be Russia. So, we have to remember today's headlines, history's judgment are never the same. And so saying that, I think we've got some big challenges. Big challenge in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But I think we will get it right if we're patient with the fact that Afghanistan is the fifth poorest country in the world. It was always going to be tough. Right. I think we're making progress on the Iranian problem because the Iranian regime is inherently weak, particularly after what happened to it in June of 2009. The sanctions are biting on an economy that is very weak. I think there are new challenges on the horizon, like Mexico. The border with Mexico is beginning to resemble a failed state, where the Mexican police can't be trusted and the Mexican army is outgunned by the drug cartels. That's really dangerous. And I'll tell you, in 1996, I went with the Stanford football team to the Sun Bowl in El Paso. I was provost. And we held the big banquet across the border in Juarez. I went to the Sun Bowl this past year with Stanford, and nobody went anywhere near Juarez. And in that period of time, that border has become exceedingly dangerous. So we have some new challenges, but I think we'll come through them.
Okay, great. Well, in a moment, I want to open it up for some of your questions. There was one sort of Google-related question I had to ask you. So
Yes.
opportunity. But last time you were here, we talked a fair bit about something that's really important to us here at Google, which is internet freedom. Free expression on the internet. And while you were secretary, you actually did a lot of work in that area and really advanced the ball forward. Yes. How do you? I know you have some really great thoughts about this. How do you see this going, and what would you counsel? A company like Google who cares deeply about this, what would you counsel us to do, and how to do with governments to deal with this?
Well, let me take the big one, the elephant in the room. It's China on this issue.
There we go.
And when people say to me, when will China surpass the United States as the most important global economy and political player, I say one thing. Can you imagine that a country that is as terrified of the internet, that it's hacking into people's servers and trying to find that last human rights advocate, is that country going to lead the knowledge-based revolution? No. And so you have with the internet in countries, particularly like China, this clash between something that is democratizing, something that is information giving, something that allows people to remotely organize themselves, and the authoritarians' need to control all of those. My view is that, and I understand, short-term issues like today's earnings or the quarterly earnings. I used to be a corporate director. But I also know that an enlightened long-term view says that if these countries, these authoritarians, don't come to terms with the aspirations of their people and allow more freedom of expression, it's not going to be very stable. And you're not going to be doing business in China anyway, because if China goes the wrong direction, we're going to be looking at an even more closed and even more authoritarian place where foreign businesses will be shut out, where IPR will be protected even less than it is now. And so it seems to me that the long-term view is to do what you can to enhance the capacity of citizens in these countries to use the power of the internet.
Great. Well, let's open it up to some of your questions. We have a first one right away, sir.
Your words about your experience of being required to be twice as good resonated a lot with our experiences of growing as Jewish children in Russia.
Yes.
And in that respect, I wanted to ask you, do you still pursue Russian studies at Stanford? Yes. And what do you tell your students in general? What is your focus at Stanford?
Yes, thank you. Well, my focus at Stanford, I'm teaching for the business school, and I'm teaching a course called The Global Context, which basically says, remember that governments are the principal architects of the environment in which you will be. I then teach undergraduates a course called Challenges and Dilemmas in U.S. Foreign Policy, but it won't surprise you that given my long association with things Russian, I continue to teach about Russia in both of those courses. And what I say is that I think Russia, which went through a very difficult period of time in the 90s, leading to the late 90s, the rise of Vladimir Putin, the rise of a more authoritarian instinct, is actually now there's a kind of battle going on in Russia. On the one hand, you have those who want to continue to build Russia's power and might on the basis of extractive industries, oil-based economies, where the economy is great if the price of oil is $140 a barrel and not so great if it's 70, where it's authoritarian, where its external manifestation is more like empire. And there are those who are saying, that isn't where Russia should be. Russia should be leading the global knowledge revolution. President Medvedev has said several times, Russia has the best software engineers in the world. And I always thought to myself, yes, and they're all working in the United States and Israel, and that's the problem. And to the degree that Russia can mobilize its human potential toward a more open, creative society to take advantage of all that creativity, we're all going to be better off. And so, yes, I continue to follow Russian affairs, and I actually think where Russia ends up in this is very important to international peace and stability.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, thanks for coming. I wanted to ask you, a question along the lines of how can we all get along? The politics today is so, it seems, counterproductive.
Yes.
And I don't know, I view you as actually somebody who could make a difference there,
Thank Thank you.
You know, what
Thank
could
you.
you or other people do to take a leadership role in making things more productive?
Right, and I agree with you. To be fair, our politics has always been a little rough in the United States. I mean, Thomas Jefferson leaked a letter saying George Washington was senile because he thought Washington was too close to Alexander Hamilton. I mean, our politics has always been a little rough. But I think that the pace of our politics now, driven by 24-hour news cycles and cable television, which I listen to like everybody else, but can you even tell what people are saying anymore? They're so busy yelling at each other, nobody stops to listen. And in a political system like the United States, where the founding fathers separated power between the branches of government, you need time. You need time for people not to have to go to their corners and have a mic shoved in front of their faces the minute a problem comes up. They commit to a particular solution. Now they're stuck. And if they move toward the other side, they're considered to be flip-flopping, or they're considered to be wavering, or they're not principled enough. Politics really is like sausage making. It's tough. It's not that you abandon your principles, but I can assure you, I write in the book about the civil rights legislation of 1964 and 1965, which actually allowed me to go to a restaurant for the first time. That would never have happened with cable television. Right. Because Lyndon Johnson would not have been able to put together that coalition of Northern Republicans and Texans and others to put them together and overcome this extremely difficult issue. So here's my prescription. Let's turn down the volume. Right? Let's just turn down the volume and stop yelling at each other and accusing each other. Let's recognize that we have some very crucial problems in the United States, but that we know some of the elements of how to solve them. We know that private sector-led growth is important, or we're not going to have jobs. We know that fiscal discipline is important, or we're not going to have investors. We know that immigration is important to our country because it keeps us from the tragic demographics of Russia and the sclerotic demographics of Europe. And I don't believe this is my country when I hear people say we ought to deny citizenship to the children of illegal immigrants who are born here. I don't recognize that country. Let's all agree that we need free trade so that exports can grow. And let's all agree that the K-12 education system is a crime when I can look at your zip code and know whether you're going to get a good job. And then let's work from those basic principles. I think if actually we could refocus on some of those principles and turn down the volume some, maybe we can get back to a place that we have workable politics.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, next question.
I have a question about days past. Back when the United States decided to go to Iraq, you went to Russia and discussed at length why it is a good idea to go to Iraq, and you spent quite a while behind closed doors with then President Putin. What did you discuss?
Yes. Well, that I will talk about. I think that, let me say one thing about Russia and President Putin. Things got difficult toward the end, but in global affairs, for the most part, we had very good cooperation with Russia on the Middle East, on North Korea, on the war on terrorism, very good cooperation on Afghanistan. We had trouble with Russia when we got involved in what Russia considered to be its periphery: Georgia, Central Asia, Ukraine, and the states of the Warsaw Pact like Poland and the Czech Republic. But on Iraq, I have to give President Putin credit. They voted for Resolution 1441, which was a resolution that said Saddam had to open up his WMD sites or face serious consequences. But Putin told us, I cannot agree to a resolution that will take us to war. And he said it from the very beginning. All that you can ask of another leader is that they tell you from the very beginning what they can do and what they can't do. There were some leaders who said, oh yes, we'll be with you. And then when things got tough, they weren't there. I didn't respect that. I do respect when people tell you what they can do and what they can't do. We did not have a disagreement with Russia about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. They thought he had them too. He did have capability and infrastructure. What he didn't have was stockpiles. But we disagree with Russia about what that meant in terms of what needed to be done in Iraq. But I will say also about Russia that once the war was over, Russia quite quickly became part of the solution, not part of the problem. Now, one reason that Russia did that is that they were very clear that they wanted their oil and gas contracts to be honored by the new Iraqi government. And I always felt that Russia's economic interests were more important here to Russia than almost anything else.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Sure. Next question.
Yeah, I guess to help us get past caricatures and stereotypes of foreign figureheads, can you elaborate on some of your closest personal relationships, like some of your best friends and
Yes.
even conflicts, and maybe talk about some people that struck you as either impressive or who had areas for improvement?
Yes. The person that I think, there are several that Tony Blair. Not only was he kind of a rock star, and that was clear, but he also was somebody of real principle. When he said he was going to do something, he did it. I think he believed fundamentally in the proposition that no man, woman, or child should live in tyranny. And that brought us close to him. And I have enormous admiration for him. Also, what he did in the Middle East as the quartet's envoy for the Middle East was quite impressive. Ariel Sharon, who was a tough little tank driver and was somebody who nobody would have thought to be interested in peace because he was brought to power to defeat the Palestinian resistance. But by 2003, he had taken a whole part of the Israeli political spectrum and put it in support of a two-state solution. And I think he may ultimately be one of the reasons that we will get to a Palestinian state. I quite admire Angela Merkel, who I think is, as German Chancellor, maybe in the most important position in Europe right now. The European Union is going through some very difficult times. When you have German newspapers that suggest that the Greeks sell the Acropolis to pay their debt, we have a problem of European unity. And Angela Merkel is trying to steer this course where the German taxpayer no longer wants to pay for profligate spending in the rest of Europe, and she wants to hold the European Union together, and I think she's done a remarkable job. Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, the president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the president of Liberia, a country that was on the front pages of the New York Times in 2003 with 13-year-old boys with AK-47s running the streets, where the United States sent 100 Marines in to stabilize the ports and the airport, and that country now has a chance. It's desperately poor, 25 years of civil war. But I will never forget one of the most remarkable moments. We went, Laura Bush and I went to her inaugural. And she was giving her speech, and all the African heads of state were there, and all of a sudden she said, and today, every member of my cabinet and I personally will publish our personal finances. And all these African leaders who had been cheering everything she said, this didn't sound like such a great idea. And I thought, she's changing the whole face of Africa by what she's saying here. So those are some of the people that I admired most. Probably the oddest that I met was Muammar Gaddafi. I was the first Secretary of State to go to and Colby's laughing because he was the advance on that trip. But when Gaddafi said that he wanted me to meet him in his tent, we decided that we didn't know what that meant, but it didn't sound very good. And so, but it was quite something. He's actually more rational to have a conversation with than you might imagine.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got about 5 more minutes for questions, so let's keep them coming.
I found it fascinating, just all these connections you had, kids you grew up with that came from Birmingham, and it seems like especially impressive given that underprivileged environment, but it seems like one kind of factor you had was this extreme privilege of engaged parents.
Yes.
And it seems like that's not, and I think that's something that's shared here in this room by a lot of people. How do you, it's not really something that I think is focused on enough in education today. What are your thoughts on, I guess, that, and how can your experience be a model for that type of?
Absolutely. I think you're exactly right. You've broken the code. It is engaged parents, but if you don't have engaged parents, you'd better have an engaged adult with every child. And whether it's the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, where I'm on the national board, I think they do a fine job of engagement with kids, particularly from underprivileged environments. Whether it's a teacher that takes an interest in those kids, a pastor or the community, every child has got to have some adult that says, here's how you navigate to get to be successful. And it is just, we can't just leave it on the schools to do it all. Some adult has got to be engaged with every child.
Do you think parents themselves are aware enough?
I do think parents are. You know, one of the things that I did when I came back here the last time was I formed something called the Center for a New Generation. There are now 5 of them in East Palo Alto, Redwood City, East Menlo. And they're an after-school enrichment program for kids from that region, that part of the state. And you know that's a very impoverished part of the state. But the idea that their parents didn't care was just exploded. These parents were just trying to get their kids into the center. So sometimes I think parents don't have the means, they don't have the right language, they don't know how to access the school system, but they care. And whenever we had a performance of the Center for a New Generation with the school band, and I mean the instrumental band and so forth, those parents were there taking pictures and being proud of their kids. So I think there's a lot to work with.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So we touched briefly upon race relations, because obviously you contribute a large portion of that in your book, and as well to like political friction in the country. There are a number of, or there is a current that believes that race relations are starting to rear their head again in politics, and the NAACP just put out a paper called Tea Party Nationalism about the radical right and racism in the Tea Party movement and the uprise of that. What are your thoughts as a black conservative on the Tea Party and these unsavory aspects of it?
Well, there are unsavory aspects to a lot of movements, right? They're extremists in a lot of movements. I think on balance, the Tea Party is a grassroots movement of folks who don't like where their country is going, and they're trying to express that. And sometimes they express it in ways that I don't agree, like on immigration or on free trade. But sometimes they express it in a way with which I completely agree, that the conversation in Washington and the conversation in the rest of the country is not the same conversation. And I think they're trying to get Washington's attention, that people out here are worried about having gone to college, majored in accounting because they wanted to be English majors, but they had to find a job, buying a home, as David Brooks said recently, buying a home they actually could afford, and now they find the equity is half of it. I think that's what these people are expressing. And we don't do any good by branding them with a kind of broad brush. Yes, I think there are some people who've expressed racist views. But frankly, I didn't like it very much when people said George Bush was a racist because of Katrina. You know, suddenly he was a racist because a hurricane hit one of the poorest parts of America in New Orleans. This is a term we need to stop throwing around. Because given our deep wounds as a country, the worst and most incendiary thing that you can do is call somebody else a racist. And you better be sure that that's actually what's going on rather than you just have a political disagreement. And so I would tell people in the Tea Party, stop saying those things, and I would tell people in NAACP, stop saying those things. And let's focus on the problems that we share jointly. Because America is an extraordinary place where, you know, 2 black secretaries of state, black president of the United States, and with the heritage and history that we have, that means we've come a very long way. So while I fully understand that there are elements of many movements that I don't agree with and that there's racism in some of them, it's really something that we ought to step back from. And I said turn down the volume. Well, this is one where we really better turn down the volume, because we will actually empower the most extreme elements of our society if we're constantly pointing to them and giving them a megaphone.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good.
Let's try to get the last 2 questions in
sure.
here.
So from the outside looking in, it seems like there's a schism between government and policy and technology, at least in the U.S., which seems interesting because as at Google, you know, we're in the business of changing the world, and essentially so are you. So how do you think, ideally, we could bridge that gap between the technologies we're developing here and what policymakers are trying to do, from an implementation or an efficiency standpoint.
Yeah, I'll give you two examples where I think a lot of work could be done, and some work is being done. Technology may actually help with the school problem that I was talking about, because I would rather have the very, very, very best teacher in every classroom, and we ought to strive for that. But sometimes you have to make up for teaching that may not be optimum, and technology is a way to do it. And so I think technology and K-12 education and improvement of K-12 education is something where we can bridge some of the policy problems we have and what the technology can offer. And the other big one is in democratization. There is no doubt in my mind that the fact that people can get on the internet, and by the way, a lot of my Chinese students and friends tell me they can try and block, they can try and filter, we'll always find a way around it. And so it is having a democratizing effect. We saw the effect of it in Iran, where the regime just couldn't shut down all of the technological outlets. And I think if we're more conscious about it, I thought Hillary Clinton, Secretary Clinton, gave a very good speech about this. And I think these are things that could be followed up on. Now, I'm not asking companies to become, either part of the policy process or to become social entrepreneurs. I'm just saying that for all of us, for the long-term benefit to all of us, for our long-term interest, for technology to play a role in the betterment of K-12 education and in democratization around the world is going to benefit both policy and technology, the technology sector.
Cool. Thank you.
Great. Last question.
Dr. Rice, thank you for coming to speak with us today. I'm too short for this. In your book, you mentioned several times about how much books have shaped the way you think today. You write that one of your proudest moments was when your father gave your grandfather's books to you, and Auntie Teresa read some of her books 25 times.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you, what are some of the books from your childhood that you really cherish today?
Yes, well, thank you. Boy, you really read the book. That's great. Well, I tended as a child not to be the voracious reader that my parents were and that they wanted me to be. So they tried a lot of things, classic comics and all kinds of things. And then they realized that I discovered and loved biography. And it started with the biographies of the great composers. So Mozart's biography, I wanted to be Constanza Mozart. Most little girls had a crush on Elvis. I had a crush on Mozart. My parents gave me all these books about the composers. As I went through life, it has been biography that has been most stimulating for me. I read during 2006 the lives of the Founding Fathers, a series of really great biographies, Jefferson, Hamilton, Madison, Franklin. And it really convinced me of this belief that I have that what seems impossible one day later on seems inevitable, because when you read their biographies, there is no earthly reason the United States of America should have ever come into being, with a third of George Washington's troops down to smallpox, taking on the greatest military power of the time. And so I loved those biographies. I've gone on to read a wonderful biography of Teddy Roosevelt, which is kind of the opening of the frontier of the United States. And I've read a couple of really excellent biographies recently of Joseph Stalin, which has given me, I think, new insights to Russia. So I find through people's lives and people's experiences that not only does history open up to me in a way that it doesn't if I just read the history, but the lessons of the triumph of the human spirit, both for good and for evil, opens up to me. And so I continue to be a dedicated biography reader, and maybe one reason that I wanted to write this book, which is a kind of autobiography, although it's really my parents' story, is that I think we learn more through the vibrancy of people's lives than in any other way.
Well, speaking of biography,
Yes.
we wanted to have a chance for a book signing. I think you'll be available for
I
a
will
while
be.
longer
That's
to do
right.
that. Encourage all of you, if you haven't picked up a copy of the book, to do so. But we're just really, really thrilled to have you here again, Dr. Rice, and thank you so much.
Thank
for
you.
coming.
Thank you, and thanks for a great conversation. Thank you.